Okay, well, we're going to get started. I'm going to try to keep my eye on admitting people, but if other hosts, I know pastoral staff and Chris are on, if you're able to admit people, that would be good. Thank you. This is our final session today, and we will be talking at the end kind of what do we do with this and where do we go from here. But let me open us with a prayer to get us started. Would you pray with me? Holy God, we praise you and thank you for this day. We thank you for the ability to have gatherings on Zoom on an icy cold winter day. Be with us as we continue our study and conversations, and just stir in us what you are calling us to be as your people, as we have learned, and pray that what we have learned will not just be something that tucks away in our heads, but is lived out in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So I know a lot of us have been very moved by this study and by the stories that we've heard through this study, challenged by information that we've learned and exposed to in this study. And while we might have strong feelings and sympathies and angst, we can also feel overwhelmed and paralyzed and not sure what we do with all of this. So in today's session, Jamar is going to talk about that, and he's going to offer some practical suggestions for ways that we can partner in the cause of seeking racial justice and equity. So before we watch the video, I just wanted to update you. So he's going to talk in the video about the Mississippi flag. Since he made this video, so like Chris has mentioned over the last couple of weeks, we're kind of like living some of this stuff now. It's not just ancient history. And the Mississippi flag has changed since he made this video. So on November 3rd, 2020, in a state referendum, the people of the state of Mississippi voted to approve a new flag for their state, which now features a white magnolia blossom with the words "In God We Trust" on a red field with a gold border around it and like a blue pail behind the magnolia. In the past, they had a flag with the Confederate insignia in the corner of the flag. So on January 11th of 2021, recent history, it became the official state flag of Mississippi. So they retired the old flag on June 30th of 2020. They voted in a referendum in November 3rd for the new flag, and on January 11th of 2021, it became the official flag. So this is happening in real time, yay. And so I'm just sharing that update as you'll hear him mention the flag in this series. So with that, let me pull up. This is the urgency of now. Let me get my screen up.
Burdened by the brutality of racism in America, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the microphone near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, many of us remember that line about being judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. But before that, toward the beginning, he uses a phrase that I just love: the fierce urgency of now. To quote Dr. King, He says, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off," he said, "or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark, desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice." That was 1963. We've seen so much progress since then. We've seen a Black president elected. We've seen the blockbuster film Black Panther. We've seen Black people make entrances into professions and neighborhoods that they never had access to before. But for all that progress, we could still say that we must respond to the fierce urgency of now. Throughout this survey of US history, racism, and the church, we can see that although we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go. So this segment serves to present some practical ways to address the current state of racial injustice in America. Those who have humbly submitted to the tutelage of history can't help but exclaim, "I have to do something." Here's how to do it. So, whenever I give talks on racial justice, whether at a church or a conference or some other event, there's usually a Q&A at the end, and the most frequent question I ever get is, what do I do? This is from the people who understand that racism is a problem, not only in the past, but still to the present day, and they want to be part of the solution. They want to know how to fight racism. Well, over time, I used to just give sort of this scattering of answers, try this, do that, here's a suggestion. I finally developed a framework that I hope is helpful, and it's called the Arc of Racial Justice. ARC is an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Let me break it down. So, first of all, awareness. You have to know how race operates in order to be an effective anti-racist activist. In other words, you have to study the history. So doing things like following this video series is one way you can build awareness. But in general, as people in this nation, we have to do more when it comes to figuring out what has happened with racism, how it functions from a sociological and an individual perspective, and all the different ways that race and racism manifest themselves in our society. So, some practical suggestions for building your awareness. Watch documentaries. Or my favorite answer when people ask me a question is just 2 words long: Google it. We have so much information available on the internet. It's literally at your fingertips, but there are other things that you can do to raise your awareness as well. You can take a class, whether in person or online. If I'm talking to any college students or even any graduate students, if you haven't taken a class in history, please do so, especially US history, beyond whatever the requirement is. There are many other ways to build your awareness as well. You can read books, particularly books on US history. Go through some of the ones that I've recommended in previous segments. You can also talk to others and get their perspectives in order to increase your awareness. So knowledge is part of what it takes to fight for racial justice. But it doesn't just stop there. We can't just have these big heads full of information and not do anything. Another aspect is relationships. So when we think about Christianity, when God wanted to reconcile humankind to himself, he didn't send an email or a memo. He didn't type a tweet or post a comment on Facebook. No, God sent a person, his son, Jesus Christ. And what that tells us is that all reconciliation is incarnational. It happens through real people communicating with one another and getting to know one another. All reconciliation then is relational. So relationships are absolutely indispensable to this work of racial justice. You got to put flesh and blood on people. We can't just study this in the abstract. We have to know folks and look in their eyes when they tell us about their racial experiences, hear the sound of their voice when they talk about their perspectives on these issues and get to know them beyond just the stereotypes and the big blanket statements that people make about other people groups. Because when you know someone, when you care about someone, then what affects them starts to affect you. Finally, and this I think is critical, is commitment to action. You see, I think a lot of people can agree that awareness is important. And a lot of people will agree that relationships are important. In fact, they'll even say, well, listen, I treat all people the same. I try not to treat anyone better or worse because of their skin color. And in fact, I have lots of relationships with people across the color line. Something I hear a lot of times from white people is some of my best friends are Black. The idea behind that, it's well intentioned, but it's basically saying, well, since I have good individual relationships with people who are different, then I can't be part of the problem of racism. So why do I need to care about this? Well, this gets to the idea of commitment. It's the idea that racism works itself out not just through interpersonal relationships, but also through systems, structures, laws, policies, institutions. And so if we really want to commit to anti-racist action, then we have to commit to fighting the ways racism shows up in impersonal ways, not just interpersonal ways. That's this commitment. Furthermore, a commitment implies some staying power. Like, this isn't just going to go away after you watch this video or after a day, a week, or a month, but in fact, it's an entire posture. It's a way of doing life that is fundamentally oriented toward being able to spot racism wherever it shows up and then doing something about it. So the arc of racial justice has laid out a framework, a very basic framework for understanding various kinds of anti-racist actions. It's not a linear process. It's not something anyone does in order, like step one, step two, step three, and it certainly doesn't end. It's a cycle that's going to continue as long as you're engaged in this work. But let's get even more practical here. So the ARC model helps us sort of conceptualize and have a framework of things. And now I want to talk about just a few ways that we can begin to address racism in the church and beyond. Now, I'll give you a heads up. These focus on more of those systemic and institutional aspects I was talking about. It's not really advice on how to build relationships across the color line. It's broader than that, gets down to affecting the systems that affect thousands of people, even the entire country. First off, let's dive right in. I think the only other R word that's more controversial among Christians than racism is the word reparations. Yeah, that one. Reparations, when people hear that, they think of just sort of writing a check to Black people as recompense for slavery. Well, I certainly wouldn't exclude that, but I would give some context to this theory and the concept of reparations. We can't talk about racial justice unless we talk about money. It's the idea that race-based chattel slavery was fundamentally an exploitative economic system. Throughout centuries of labor, enslaved Black people were not paid for their work. Not only were they not paid during their time of enslavement, this continued after the Civil War, after emancipation, and during the Jim Crow era too. For instance, they were excluded from home ownership, and your home is typically your greatest source of wealth. They were excluded from certain educational opportunities, education that could have granted them training or degrees, which could have enabled them to get jobs and positions that would have made them more secure financially. And they were prevented from taking certain jobs. We talked about in the military how Black soldiers were relegated to menial roles. They couldn't achieve many command positions and the salaries that might go with that. This happened even in the civilian realm as well, where Black people were not promoted or were excluded from certain jobs that would have enhanced their family's wealth and lead to economic advancement. And because of factors like this, generational poverty going all the way back to the antebellum era persists to this day. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans serves as an example. For every dollar in a white household, Black households have about 7 cents. Black people comprise 13% of the US population, but hold only 3% of the nation's wealth. So, what do we do about this as a nation? More specifically, what do we do about this as a church? There's a Presbyterian pastor named Duke Kwan, and he talks about this concept of ecclesiastical reparations. I like this idea of ecclesiastical reparations because I think many Christians have the idea that we have to wait on politics or government to sort of pass a law or make a policy around reparations. And the reality is, we as the church can do something about the economic exploitation of Black people and trying to remedy the present problems that have come from this historic injustice. And there's precedence for this too. Pastor Kwan references the Old Testament and a prayer that Daniel prayed. Daniel prayed for himself and also for the people who came before him. He says he prayed for our princes and our ancestors who were covered with shame in Daniel 9:8. What that means is that even though you have not owned a slave, even though I, in my lifetime, have never been a slave in the sense of race-based chattel slavery, that we are still responsible for what people did who came before us. And we are still responsible for the ongoing repercussions and impacts of those past actions. So within Christianity, there's a sense of corporate and communal responsibility. You could apply this same idea to the idea of reparations. We simply cannot be serious about anti-racism unless we talk about that topic they tell you not to talk about, which is money, and the fact that race-based chattel slavery and its ongoing legacy has affected the financial situation of African descendants of slaves in America. So reparations, at least a conversation about it, is one practical step that we can take to bring about racial justice. Here's another one: take down Confederate monuments. I go to school in the state of Mississippi, at the University of Mississippi. At the entrance of campus, as I record this, there stands a Confederate statue. It's stood there for decades. It serves as a rallying point for neo-Confederates and white supremacists. They gather around it as their rallying point. There are all kinds of monuments and signs and symbols to the Confederacy. Again, in Mississippi, it is the last state in the Union that has the Confederate emblem in the canton of its state flag. Every time I pass that flag, it's a sign to me as a Black American that I don't belong there. Or if I do belong there, it's in a second-class status position. I think we need new symbols and new monuments that celebrate the unity of all Americans across racial and ethnic lines. So what would it look like instead of a Confederate monument? We had monuments to people like Ida B. Wells, who used investigative reporting to bring to light the reality of lynching and hope to confront it. What if we had monuments to people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was born a poor sharecropper in Mississippi in 1917, and in her 40s became a civil rights activist, lost everything she had in pursuit of justice for people in America? I think we need to have a greater imagination of what our civic spaces could look like and who gets represented there. Here's another suggestion on a practical level. How about we start a new seminary? No shade to existing seminaries, but here's the reality. If an institution was started without an intentional focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's going to be very hard for that institution to add those things in later. I heard a pastor one time give the analogy of baking a cake. And he said, what if you were baking a cake and you had the bowl and you had the flour and you had the eggs and you had the baking soda, whatever goes into a cake, and you made it, you mixed up the batter, you put it in the oven, and you take it out and you taste it, and you realize you forgot to put in the sugar. Now what do? You just pick up a handful of sugar and sprinkle it on top? It's not going to be the same. So many of our institutions are functioning that way when it comes to race and diversity. They forgot to bake it in to the very foundations of the institution, and now they're trying to sprinkle some diversity on the top in order to fix the problem. But it just won't work. So perhaps we need new institutions, for instance, a new seminary. In this new seminary, you could, number one, assemble a diverse teaching staff of men and women from across the racial and ethnic spectrum. You could also plan a curriculum that was intentionally diverse so that most of your curriculum isn't just reading dead white guys. As helpful as they can be, there's a lot more people who have weighed in on theology from a Christian perspective. You can set up the systems of the seminary to accommodate people who may come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so night classes and weekend classes, and not just a traditional setup where many people who are working can't make it. You can set up scholarships that would help racial and ethnic minorities as a form of reparations, but then you bring them into a seminary that has them in mind from the start. They're represented in the faculty and staff, and even all the way up to the trustees level. So let's imagine what that might look like to have a seminary faithful to the scriptures, but also faithful to the part of the scriptures that talks about God's beautiful vision for heavenly diversity. Here's one of my favorites. Make Juneteenth a national holiday. Juneteenth is a mashup of the words June and 19th. It represents the day when enslaved people in Texas first learned of their emancipation, and to this day, it stands as the oldest celebration of Black freedom in America. I think we should make Juneteenth a national holiday for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is one of the most epochal events in US history. I mean, think about it. For centuries, the nation condoned race-based chattel slavery. It took the nation's bloodiest war, the Civil War, to bring about the abolition of slavery. And so this is not just an event in Black history. This is US history. What making Juneteenth would do is cause us as a nation every year to pause and think and remember, to look back at where we were, a society that once called Black people property, to say that we had to go to war to end it, and to honestly celebrate the progress that we've made, that race-based chattel slavery no longer is the law of the land. That's progress, and we should celebrate it. At the same time, making Juneteenth a national holiday would also remind us of where we are and where we still need to go. It would serve as motivation for us to keep pressing and keep pushing so that our children and the Christians who come after us in this nation can say that things are better for them in the future than they were for us in the past. At the end of the day, we can make many, many more suggestions, but this much is clear. The American church has compromised with racism. Countless Christians have ignored, obscured, or misunderstood this history. The excuses are gone. This information cannot be hidden. Now that racism has been exposed, what are you going to do about it? In the Bible, James 4:17 says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and then doesn't do it, it is sin for them. The church today must practice the good that ought to be done when it comes to racial justice. To look at this history and then refuse to act only perpetuates racist patterns. It's time for the church to stand against racism and to compromise no longer.
Uh-oh. So, thinking about Martin Luther King's quote that he shared with us today, the fierce urgency of now. What, in your view, is the fierce urgency of now in our time, in our society, things that you think need to be addressed urgently. And if you'll raise your hand, I'll try to call on people so we're not all talking over each other, but there's like 2 screens worth of people, so I might miss somebody. Janet.
Thank you. Well, I'm not entirely clear on some of the suggestions that were made. The one about the new seminary sounds interesting. The Juneteenth also, and also in collaboration with, we already have Martin Luther King Day. But on reparations, I do have some concern in that whenever the word reparations.
If you could just hold that, because we're going to talk about that, the reparations, a little bit later. So if you hold on to that.
Then what I would say is what to do now.
What is the fierce urgency like?
Right. I would say to have the black churches and the white churches talk to each other to find out with each other what their feelings are.
Okay. Thank you. Gail, I think I saw your hand. You have to unmute.
Okay. I was just thinking of Westminster, and although we have made efforts, and this is certainly changing me, and I expect that it's changing everybody that's participated in here, that somehow could we fit this into one of the vision committees. I think it's important enough that we have to focus as a church on how we can respond to this, and then hopefully let it go out into the community. That's the feeling that I have. So more of us learning more, like he said, educate yourself, Google, and the first part that he did. I think there has to be an important effort in the church to keep doing this sort of thing and bringing more and more people in to be educated. And it's so important that it would be part of what I would liken it to, one of the vision committees.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Carol and Dennis Swartz, and then we'll go to Ann McNally.
Actually, we both should speak to this. One of the experiences that we had when we were on Cape Cod, we went to a Methodist church there, and in the Methodist church, you get your ministers assigned to you. And what was it, about 2000? It was early 21st century. We got an African American pastor, and it was really a wonderful growth experience for our church, which was, Cape Cod is pretty white. He happened to be a singer, and we had a very small but very good choir, and we did a lot of spirituals, and we of course heard his perspective.
Yeah, it's not an easy one to do. He also, his babysitter, by the way, was Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he actually had a lot of memories of Martin Luther King from his young life.
Yeah.
One of the things he did was he had us do an outreach to there was an African American church in Hyannis. And it was rather interesting because at least one of our members said, oh, she thought that was terrible because, he was trying to convert us to an African American church. But I will say that our church became more diverse just as a result of having a more diverse person in our staff. We got more African Americans coming. We also got more of LGBT people there, So, you know, it was really wonderful to see some of the young parents going over and introducing their 8-year-old to a transgender gentleman, with, you know, no thought about it one way or the other. So it was a real growth experience for us. He was there with us for 9 years until he retired. And I'm not suggesting that we get rid of any of our ministers whom I love dearly, but it was a good experience for us.
Thank you. Jane.
Just one thought in terms of what I see as an urgent thing now is voting rights, that we really have to make sure that that does not continue to be interfered with.
Very much so. Ann McNally.
Yeah, Gail, I'm so glad you said that one of the vision teams should take on diversity, because in fact, we already have. Vision Quest 1, expand our witness. Janet and I have been trying to get something started on that, and it's been a challenge, I'll be honest with you. Right now, the only thing that we're doing, and it's not a little thing, but I think it's a very, very small start, is we're supporting a group in Chester, an education group in Chester. Can't remember the name of it, but I would love, and I know Janet joins me, I think she joins me, anybody else who wants, from this group, who wants to help Vision Quest 1 work on diversity, please get in touch with me or Janet, because the only way this is going to happen is if we get a group of people that feel the same, that can come up with some ideas for what we at Westminster can do. So Gail, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ann. Chris.
I just kind of want to echo what Jane said about voting rights. What I saw with Stacey Abrams, and I didn't know her story, was that she, I believe, was the daughter of a Methodist minister. And it was her faith that compelled her to go do this work. And I know that Pennsylvania was one of the states that is introducing policies in, I forget if it's the House or Senate, and it's the state who has introduced the most policies that would fall under the category of voter suppression. So thinking of our particular state and our particular communities, just seconding that from Jane as sort of that idea of the fierce urgency of now.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. Well, as you've worked through this study, what has, maybe there was a particular session or something you heard or learned or a story, but what has made you feel most overwhelmed by what was shared, and why? Cheryl, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I am. No, I'm scratching Ted's shoulder.
I couldn't see your hand was out of the view.
Oh, it was above the screen, sorry. One thing I noticed, Princeton University was the first of the Ivy League ones to accept Black people into their classrooms. We've learned that from another class, and the Black students wanted their own university, so they started Lincoln University. They started out wanting all white professors, then they decided to have Black professors. Instead of building a new university, it would be nice if a lot of the country helped. Lincoln University has been in financial trouble. It was supposed to be the Princeton for the Black people. And we have this university already. Why don't Black people donate back to it, and our church could outreach? Maybe they already do. I don't know what all they donate to, but we have a university set up to educate and make pastors, and it's a very diverse curriculum if you look it up. because I looked it up after we had the class on it. It's been way over a year ago, but it was set up. The Black people chose not to go to Princeton, even though they were allowed, unlike Harvard. Princeton gave them a degree in that. So I think we have a university set up where they could get a good education. There should be more universities that are already established that, other than there's a few Black universities, but there's other universities that could add to their curriculum instead of building a new one, because it's easier to add a course than it is to build a whole new university. And we could all write Stanford, we could all write Yale, we could all write the University of Penn. I mean, there's a lot we could do to encourage the universities that exist to have more classes like we're doing right now.
All right, thank you, Cheryl. Connie and Bill.
I think what I've gotten out of this course, as well as the readings we did last summer, is that I feel that our Christian church in America, the United States, has been quite complicit in kind of pushing the can down the road, generation to generation to generation. And so since I feel sort of personally part of that complicity, part of the problem, I'm feeling rather motivated to be part of the solution.
Good. So anything that popped out over the study that does feel overwhelming to you, that is, you know, could be paralyzing? Is that Sue Kelly raising her hand?
I see Margaret Pope. Margaret Pope has her hand up.
Okay, listen, I think Sue
I
Kelly.
think can you hear?
Yeah, and then we'll go to Meg. Go ahead, Sue. Oh, you just muted yourself. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I have an iPad and it's really doing whatever it wants to do. I would say what really made an extra impact on some of the unconscionable specific atrocities was the fact that they were intentionally hidden, systemically hidden. And then kind of a layer on top of that was really difficult was how in very recent history, there's so many intentional actions to suppress people of color. So it just seemed extremely heavier than certainly than any one person could bear. And the importance of looking to the Bible and looking at that history and God's word was just so much more important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Meg Pope.
Hi.
There she is.
Yeah. So for people who don't know me, I'm a therapist and I'm a counseling director at a family service agency. So we see a lot of people that are impoverished for counseling. And so you listen to stories all day long. And I know we're not discussing reparations yet, but when I hear the stories of the needs and the stories of how people are affected, it's just overwhelming. When you talk about overwhelming, to think I want all this for this person that I've sat with, and I want all that for that person that I've sat with. And I know it's multiplied so many times, it just feels so difficult to figure out how we could make it better for them all.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I see that Gabrielle and Ernie's, somebody, I don't know if it's both hands or.
I've been struck during this whole study of the history of the church's complicity with how the idea of individual salvation has been so elevated theologically, really as an excuse for ignoring the physical, emotional, political well-being of African Americans. And I mean, we still see large segments of the Christian church that basically say, getting you quote unquote saved is our goal, and we don't care about you as a living person. They don't say it in those words, but that's the impact. And I think we all, having been raised in a tradition like that, I'm very conscious. I appreciate very much that in Westminster, we hear a much broader perspective of what the gospel is calling us to do. It doesn't exclude our personal relationship with God, but it does include our relationship with our fellow human beings.
Thank you, Ernie. Did I see the Eamon's hand up, or no, I guess. Oh, Betsy Ballantyne.
Well, okay, so Meg, I appreciate what you had to say and Ernie also, because this idea of relationship is extremely important, because without true dialogue, you can't really have that kind of relationship that you need to have. I know that my daughter's mother-in-law's whole life she's been a churchgoer all her life, is entirely different than mine. Very strong belief. And you know that my son-in-law is African American and his mother is. And it's entirely a different thing. And I think one of the things we need to do is actually, instead of thinking about ways we can, what do they want? What do they want? Having this relationship with other people will help us to put our heads together to say, hey, how do we address some of this? And I think the relationship that we don't have with an African American church or those folks that are might be really significant. We don't have that experience. You don't have the experience of, walking in a store and getting followed around. Okay, for instance, I mean, that's just an example, but that kind of thing. And also, I think we need to, as Christians, and I mean, Westminster's been fabulous. Don't get me wrong. I love that. And I love the idea of going out and going into the, trying to have the vision committee get involved in this and so on. But, just this week, and we've had a horrible week. I've been very upset about it. But that two pastors from the American Baptist Convention compared Kamala Harris to Jezebel, and came out, one guy's name is Steve Swofford and the other guy's name is Tom Buck. And they came out, now those are Christians that are leading a whole group of people in that direction. And I think we need to have, some kind of, understanding of, I understand where it's coming from because this course has really prepared me for that, but we need to be able to address it in a meaningful way and deal with it. And that's a big thing because, the American Baptist Convention is the largest group of Protestant Christians in the whole United States. So there's a whole bunch of people listening to these folks. Where do we stand? What do we do? How do we handle it? So those are two things I would say. And having that personal relationship, I think, changes people. Okay, that's another piece. I'll get off.
Just notice it's the Southern Baptist, not the American Baptist Convention. They're different denominations. So just want to make sure you saw that Chris posted that. It's the Southern Baptist Convention. Yeah.
I have an American Baptist friend who would have smacked my hand if I didn't say something.
I was going to ask, it didn't sound like the American Baptist denomination.
David went to Eastern Baptist Seminary, okay? You know, so yeah. And had one, and his professors that were African American, one was a preaching professor, was the best ever and really taught him. So, you know, there's nothing like a Baptist preacher, man. Get going. But
so Jamar talked about the arc, you know, the awareness, which, you know, he said, you know, we're doing that in this course of you know, learning and hearing stories, and but you know, that's an ongoing thing. Then there's the relationships of building relationships and getting to hear each other's stories, to care about each other, to know what's somebody's truth and reality. And then there's also the commitment to action. So that third aspect, which I can hear that over and over through comments through this morning, that this group I feel like is chomping at the bit right now to both do the relationships, but also that commitment to action. Of all the things that he talked about, of some practical ways you could take action, was there anything in particular that you heard that resonated with you? Something that kind of went, caught your imagination or your passion? Nick.
Well, this whole idea of commitment to action, I think, is really essential. And one part of it is the idea that when you see racism or you hear an offhanded comment that's racist, that it's really important that you confront it. That if we don't confront it, that person will keep saying those things. Maybe they'll keep doing it even if you do confront them. But I think we owe it to try to stop it whenever we see it. And it can be very subtle, like I mentioned once with credit cards. There's a whole way it can be done in education. But if we don't confront it and deal with it, it's never going to change. You know, one thing he makes a very good point about is that racism constantly evolves. It gets more subtle, it goes underground. And unless people confront it and they deal with it when they see it, it's not going to ever go away. So the commitment to action to me means it's got to be confronted, as uncomfortable as it may be to confront it. And as much as you may open yourself to possible violence, you have to do it. There's just no way around it.
Thank you. John.
I don't know if he went into it in the video, but in the chapter, one of the things he talks about is hosting, either hosting or participating in pilgrimages or freedom schools. And I was kind of reading this chapter from the perspective of like how does this impact the ministry of a local church and ours, for example. I really like the idea that particularly for white people, doing the work of exploring our country's past and figuring out what our own place in it. I mean, I think that should be an integral part of discipleship. You know, we talk about things like prayer and spiritual disciplines, and I think it needs to become, like you all are saying, I think it's just something to think about, is how does that just become part of our spiritual practice, you know? But I love the idea of a pilgrimage. You know, I mean, we went well. Right now, obviously, we're not going anywhere, but you know, things like mission trips are kind of have been a staple part of you know, the church and certainly my role as well. But you know, making pilgrimages that will intentionally do a lot of this kind of work, you know, and there are places that even do that, organizations that host pilgrimages that kind of visit a lot of the sites that were part of, you know, the Freedom Riders in the 60s. And there's now this memorial to victims of lynching that's in Montgomery, Alabama, and groups have been going there. And I think to make it a more integral part of our spiritual development in tangible ways, it's similarly to how we do, other things as far as our, our faith development. I think the possibilities are really really exciting when you think about it. There are things that feel overwhelming, but I do think there are some things that are attainable, I think, if we put our energy and resources behind it.
Thank you. That we heard one of the next conferences, there was somebody there who, that's what she does. She does these pilgrimages, which I think would be really a very rich thing, to offer for our congregation and community. I think it'd be wonderful to do it with the Black church, and to travel together and to do that. I saw a chat. Oh, okay, Carol, I would just put it up. I wonder how different this discussion would be if we tied it to St. Paul's or other in Westchester, especially since resuming no one has to feel uncomfortable being in someone else's home turf. Could we do this again? Invite outside church? So yeah, these are all things that we want to talk about. And there isn't going to be just one thing we do. We've had probably almost 100 people participate in this, over the course of the 7 weeks. You might have a vision, somebody else might have, we can be doing multiple pronged things. So, that's where I want us to kind of think what is mine to do as one individual, but what is ours to do more collectively as a larger church, or maybe as a group in the church. So I really lean into that the Holy Spirit is moving among us, and listening for those nudges and paying attention to them. What might God be calling forth from me to offer that somebody else would say, yes, I've been thinking that too. Like, how do we work together to make something happen? I want to get to just talking about the reparations part, the R word that he said, yes, there's that. It's a controversial topic, as he mentioned. And then he talked about different layers of reparation. He also mentioned the name of a pastor, Duke Kwan, and I just looked him up, and I want to order his book. He has written a book with another author on reparations, A Christian Call for Repentance and Repair, that comes out in April. But in arguing for reparations, Jamar pointed to Daniel 9:8 as a proof of the power of corporate repentance. And the verse that he quoted, it says, "We and our kings and our princes and our ancestors are covered with shame, Lord, because we have sinned against you." So just throwing this out there, what is your reaction to the idea of corporate repentance? What are your thoughts on reparations? I just want to make sure that we got to, okay, the Schwartz's, I see hand up.
I guess, and what I would first say is we have to be very careful when you talk reparations. I think too often it can be seen as the solution. And if you simply pour money in and don't change the system, it's simply a Band-Aid approach. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this in many things of what we do. We think we're helping, but we don't change the fundamental structure that's underneath. And so you're simply going to go back to where you were again. You feel good about, excuse me, you feel good about what you've done, but you really haven't made any change that's going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Margie.
I looked in the book to be sure. He does not reference an article in the Atlantic by Ta-Nehisi Coates on reparations. And I think that for me, that is one of the most overwhelming subjects because of how on earth it can be done. And I want to point out that Coates says that we have paid reparations before, as a country. We paid reparations to Japanese who were imprisoned during the World War II. But he also mentioned several concrete ways in which advantages in education and advantages in access to health care, the very areas that are so blatantly noticeable during the COVID-19 epidemic as to the differences between the white and the Black population. But it takes a lot of political will, and it takes a lot of Christians trying to educate other Christians as to how this could be done, and creating a kind of political base which to push for it.
Thank you. Nick.
I have to say that this is one thing that the subject probably had the most impact on me from this book. Because initially, when I heard, the word reparations, I had an instinctive reaction against it. And my instinctive reaction against it was, well, there were a lot of other groups that were discriminated in the United States economically and every other way, not to the degree that Blacks were, but certainly when Italians first came, when Germans came, particularly during World War II, Germans' lives were greatly threatened and they lost jobs because of what was going on in Germany. But his point is a good one, is that we have set precedents about this in the past. As Margie just said, we paid reparations to the Japanese for being put in these internment camps during World War II. The American Indian, we forget, but a lot of tribes have been owned the casinos that have been set up in the United States, particularly two tribes in Connecticut that I know of, as a way for them to be paid back for the ways that they were discriminated against. And in Germany, Holocaust survivors have also been given reparations for what was taken from them and what happened to them. So there's strong precedent for countries and corporations and others paying reparations. This certainly isn't something new. And so this had an impact on me in terms of rethinking this whole question. And I have to say, it's an important question, because there are more things we could do for Blacks if we really are committed to it. But on the other hand, who is it, Marty, whoever made the point, we also don't want it to go down the drain. It has to be used for constructive purposes. And hopefully the people that we help, even if it's cash, will use it in wise ways.
I see John and Louise have their hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. I think for me, when it comes to reparations, the key point to remember is this is about creating a level playing field. So I think that would go to what Nick's saying and the points we heard earlier. This is not about writing the check necessarily to give over money. It's about creating an environment where the people that have been suppressed for so long can start to get ahead. And one thing I'd say about second and third generation Italians and Germans have the advantage that they look white. Right? So I get the point. Yes, they were discriminated against, but not to the degree that our Black cousins, brothers and sisters have done and continue to do so. So I think, to me, it's about how do we get to that point where education's the same. Betsy made the point about home ownership, how we prevent redlining and the equivalent thereof, voter suppression. It goes to, and I agree, that it goes to the systems have to change. It's the systems that, supported with economic investment in those communities to create that level playing field. I think that's all, certainly the Black people that I talk to about it, that's the overwhelming message I get is I just want to have an equal shot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be put ahead. I just want to have an equal shot.
Thank you.
Okay.
Margie, your hand's still up. Are you still, okay.
Nick or Joe, Joe's had his hand up.
Joe.
Don.
Okay, he must be on the other, I'm not seeing him on my screen.
Hi. This kind of goes with two questions. The first one, kind of what has hit us through all of this, and then with reparations. This is such a delicate needs to be handled so delicately is the only word I can say. And I'm basing that on when I was teaching, we had a program in school called Courageous Conversations, where we were to try and deal, excuse me, with, the racial divide. And many teachers, myself included, worked with African American people whom we loved and considered, the woman I worked with 20 years, Paula, an African American, we were like brothers and sisters. However, I found that when even the best intentioned conversations would come, the white people, myself included, would almost get defensive as it's all being blamed on us. And that set up a kind of a thing like, well, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? And I find for me that the most overwhelming thing would be, I'll do whatever I can, but the atmosphere of kind of they has to be blended in that we're both the African Americans and that the white people are working on this together. And Lord knows within the past divide that we've had after, Charlottesville and all these, it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of white people to think, oh, I need to do something. So it has to be, and I wish I had an answer on how to delicately bring that whole subject to a conversation where no one is feeling blamed and no one is really feeling a victim, because if they're in a victim stage, that doesn't help anybody either. It's really complicated, and I think that's what upsets me the most is how do we get past, and how do we start?
Don, did I see your hand up? Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, Jenny, I think, there's a whole host of avenues that people have explored, and some of it, I think, is helped if we think contextually, and then part of this is just sort of understanding, your community, your history, personally. There's a church in Baltimore that the tail end of January announced $500,000 over the next 5 years of reparations. The church was founded by slaveholders, and Episcopal Church decided that they were going to take $50,000 from their endowment, $50,000 from their operating each year for the next 5 years, and put those dollars into housing, education, environmental justice, civic engagement, places where, an advisory committee determined that they could be, working to support anti-racism activity in their context. One of the things that I've thought about since Lincoln University is right down the road from us. Is there some way that Westminster, recognizing that Princeton Seminary had a real significant hand in that school, and we got pretty deep connections to Princeton at this church. The possibility of establishing a scholarship, financial support for students at Lincoln University to try to give that educational advance. Some of it for me is it's so big and it's so broad and it's so all-encompassing and so systemic that some people just kind of roll their eyes when they see, oh my gosh, how can we do this? But I think the idea of reparations, if we put it into the kinds of things that I think were being spoken about changing the system and actually moving people in new directions, the chances there to make a difference. And I think every example of that, when it's seen by others, inspires others to consider contextually how we might make a difference in our own corner of the world. And it'll take a lot of that to get there, but.
Yeah. Well, and that's what we keep, everybody keep throwing your pebble into the pond, you know, and yeah, it's going to take a lot. Thanks, Don. That was very interesting to hear what that church is doing. I have one more video. It's a 5-minute video that I want to show before we end. We could go on and on and on, and we're supposed to wrap up at 12:45. If we still need to talk and people want to hang on, we can do that. But if you need to go, we need to go. But I do want to be sure that we get in this video, and then when we come back, Beth, we'll talk to you first, okay? All right. So I'm going to share the screen.
They've all done a great job. Yeah.
The sound is not working.
Jenny, you might be muted.
To step up. But God reassures
Can you hear it now?
3 times in the first 9
I'm going to start
verses
it
of
over.
Joshua 1. In the Bible, in Joshua chapter 1, it begins with God telling Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. In other words, Joshua, you're up. It's time for you to lead. Now you can imagine in this situation, Joshua's pretty nervous. I mean, he's got to lead hundreds of thousands of people, and he's got big shoes to fill. Moses, the man who talked face to face with God, and now it's Joshua's turn to step up. But God reassures him. 3 times in the first 9 verses of Joshua 1, it says, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. Now, I'm convinced that when it comes to fighting racism in the church and beyond, we don't have a how-to problem. We have a want-to problem. Look, if I gave you a pen and paper in 5 minutes, you could probably come up with a series of ways that we could address the issue of racism in the congregation and our nation. It would be things like diversifying leadership, growing in your awareness of racial dynamics in U.S. history, all those kinds of things. It's not that we don't know how to confront racism. It's the question of will we confront racism. Over time, through years of experience traveling the country, speaking at conferences, speaking at churches, all around the topic of race and the church, I've come to the conclusion that what holds us back as a church and a nation is one word: fear. Now, there's all kinds of fear. One kind of fear is what the Bible calls the fear of man, or fear of other people. We're afraid that if we take a courageous stand against racism, what are people going to say about us? What are they going to think about us? Are they going to call us names? Marxists, communists, social justice warriors, all of these things that we've seen come up time and time again in US history. Or maybe more to the point, if we do confront racism in our churches, in our institutions, in society at large, what might it cost us? For many people throughout the history of the US church and race, it's cost them jobs, it's cost them relationships, it's even cost their very lives. So fear is legitimate because confronting injustice in any form is risky. But I think there's another kind of fear that grips many of us, and particularly my white Christian sisters and brothers. It's the fear of getting it wrong. The fear that you don't know enough, that there's enough facts and data out there, but you don't have a firm enough grasp of it. And so you might actually make things worse if you dive into it. Well, let me reassure you, you will get it wrong. I guarantee it. But I also want to encourage you that that's really the only way to develop your effectiveness in fighting racial justice. No matter who you are, black, white, anyone else, if you want to get engaged in this work, you have to do the work. And that means you're going to stumble sometimes. It means that you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. But I also want to encourage you that if you want to develop your effectiveness in fighting for racial justice, you got to do it. And when you do, yes, you're going to stumble sometimes. You're going to get it wrong. But guess what? That's what makes you more effective, is that you learn from your mistakes and you keep trying. So even though fear holds us back, we got to remember Joshua chapter 1 again. God says, be strong and courageous to Joshua. But then in verse 9, he also gives him a promise. Be strong and courageous and do not fear. Why? Because the Lord is with you wherever you go. Now, here's the amazing thing. In the Old Testament, God gives Joshua a promise. In the New Testament, he gives to the church a person. His name is Jesus Christ. You might know him also as Emmanuel, which means God with us. So now, through faith in Jesus Christ, we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit by the will of God the Father to go out and fight racial injustice wherever we might see it, whether it's in the church or the society at large. It means that he who is within us is greater than he who is outside and opposing us. It means that you don't have to have fear as you engage in this work of racial justice, but you can walk forward in faith that God is with you wherever you go. It's time to stop compromising with racism in the American church, and it's time to courageously confront it.
Amen. Beth, you had your hand up before we went to that last video, so I want to give you an opportunity to share what you have to say today. Be sure to unmute. You're muted, Beth.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, my background just got noisy in a matter of the time that the video went on, but I'm going to try to say what I need to say as quickly as I can, and hopefully you won't hear too much. What I was going to mention, and I probably did not write down everybody's name who had all the great ideas. I just, at time, when someone mentioned something like Joe, Nick, Betsy, John, Chris, Carolyn, Don, and yourself, that I think they're all wonderful ideas. I don't even know myself how to start it, or where exactly we start. I liked some of the things that Joe was mentioning, that he had what was called a courageous conversation. And I think the last time that I spoke, I had mentioned that St. Paul's had done that. It was probably like 10 years ago. And there were a lot of churches in the area that did participate, and they held it at Westchester University, and there were different breakout sessions that you could do. It was more, I guess, about racism in the community and, how the church can better be involved. There were several churches that I could think of in the borough that were there. There were some, of course, from the outskirts. So I didn't know how they did, the inviting or whatever. I just knew the Baptist Church of Westchester and Holy Trinity, which is across the street from it, the Methodist Church. So most of those churches there on High Street, kind of like a block over from Westminster used to be years ago. Had that, and I thought that was a start, but I can't know in the community, how to level it. And some of the things that was Joe again was saying about the things like housing or things like loans and and the businesses and turning down, being turned down for loans. In fact, I just heard this morning that I wrote down some of the information that 52% of Blacks, now this information is from 2017, I believe, 52% of Blacks have been turned down for loans as compared to 25% of whites. And then when it comes to the small businesses, the statistics were 25% of small businesses have been turned down for loans as compared to only 2% of white small businesses. And I'm just saying, I just don't know where to start, but I did like some of the things that that Jamar had said, like publicly denouncing racism, the modern day, join a modern day or take part in a modern day civil rights movement. I think there's been a lot of things, of course, we've spoken of that, and it's always in the news, of, in the last, past 4 years, I'll say, the president, leading to dividing the country, racially. And, keeping things going in terms of that. And I just know my brother had said recently that that flag does not have the same meaning for him, talking about the United States flag does not have the same meaning for him as it did, years ago, because of all this racial unrest. And even starting the very beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement that started with Colin Kaepernick, of course, Donald Trump intervened and, said that, there's no more kneeling. And he was, peacefully protesting. He had even asked, and I can't remember, might have been a general, somebody high up in the military, what's a way to peacefully do this? And they had mentioned that when you go to a grave of a fallen soldier that's been buried at Arlington National Cemetery, you kneel beside the grave. And that's how he came up with the idea of kneeling, as opposed to not getting up at all. He was still paying respect, but in a way that he wanted to be noticed for his cause. And of course, Donald Trump got in there and said his thing, and any of his followers that, were, some of these racist organizations or groups, just made it worse. It was just like, festering. And so hopefully with bringing it back to the church and, wanting to do something to make things better, as I mentioned, and of course, Joe and everybody else mentioned different ways. And as I said, I think they all work, and trying to find out a way or where we could start.
Thank you. And I'm very encouraged by all of you, and that you've stuck with this study, that you've taken the time on a Sunday morning to be part of the Zoom conversation. And I'm sensing God's Spirit moving in our hearts, in this church, in our community, in our nation. Right now, it's a very, very dark, troubling time that we are facing as a nation. But I loved how Jamar ended with reminding us as Christ's church that we have Jesus in us, with us, going before us, and to have courage and to know we are not alone. When we started this whole series, Jamar, I shared this quote from Jamar where he said, "The American church needs the carpenter from Nazareth to deconstruct the house that racism built and remake it into a house for all nations. My hope for this video series is that you would move from being actively or passively racist to being actively anti-racist." And that has been my hope. And I feel encouraged by the things that I'm hearing all of you share, that God's moving our hearts and moving us to try to pick up this work and to do it. There are some things that I want to share with you that we are planning. So Jamar has written a second book that follows up The Color of Compromise. This one just came out. It's called How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. I've ordered the study. It will be released April 1st. So we're hoping to follow up this Color of Compromise study with this How to Fight Racism. So this is taking kind of what we've done today of suggestions, you know, some of the things he's shared, and he really expands upon it. And we're also going to talk about possibly bringing him to speak to us, either during the pandemic or if we can bring him here in person after the pandemic, but going to see where that leads. So that study will come after Easter. Following today, we go into Lent, and there will be a Lenten study, Simon Peter, Flawed and Faithful Disciples. So I encourage you to either join a Lenten group during the week or come back on Sundays and be part of our Lenten study. We'll be doing that study as a group during Journey. If you did not participate in the 21-day racial equity challenge that we did back in June as a church, you can still find all those resources on our website. I put in the chat a link that would take you into the website with all those resources. So if you hadn't done it and you want to, that's a great place to get more resources, see documentaries that are suggested and those kind of things. So if you look in the chat, I put the link in there, how to get into it. Sue Kelly also, after the 21-day challenge, felt God moving her. And I'm going to let her share with you something that she's been led to, that we're also inviting anybody who'd like to be a part of it with her to be part. So Sue, I'm going to allow you to talk about Be the Bridge. You have to unmute.
Let me know when you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I prepared this information. I started looking for what to do immediately after the 21-day race equity challenge. And it left me with the work of processing my white grief. Hearing the truth of racial history really just crushed me, and it left me with the feeling of urgency, just like we were talking today, to do something. I wanted to make a difference. The question was how, and then I learned about a Facebook group called Be the Bridge. Be the Bridge Facebook members are required to complete several courses and reading before being added as a member who can even make a comment. So this was a place to be the bridge and build the bridge, not to tear it down. The buildthebridge.com offers a structure of courses and study, and I joined to find a good path of intentional steps and a structure to help me find the how I could make a difference with my goal of being involved with a lifetime of work. I felt that when I started this, the world was letting me into an unknown. This was an organization with white as a minority. But the first class would be all white with white facilitators, so that lowered some of my anxiety. Be the Bridge requires all new white members to take a 4-session class named Be the Bridge 101, a unit for white group members. Now, working through these sessions, I learned I was a lot whiter than I ever realized. The first steps are to listen and learn. And I took the 4 sessions of 1.5 hours each of listening and completing the homework before I could really get deeper into my own self-talk and understand my prejudices of all kinds. I did feel God's pull. The class started something within me, and I just finished repeating yet that class again. Prayer, sharing thoughts with friends, and the open door of Westminster brought me to suggest to Jenny that Westminster might consider a book discussion group using the book written by the founder, LaTasha Morrison. The book is titled Be the Bridge, Pursuing God's Heart for Racial Reconciliation. This book discussion would be an opportunity to build a small group of trust with faith and hope. Between meetings, individuals would read the book and reflect on the questions within the sections of the book. Then when the group gathers weekly for Zoom, the discussion would lean towards sharing emotion, reactions, surprises, and life experiences. We would discuss our struggles with discussing what has been left as never discussed. So that would be my suggestion. And Jenny did offer the time today to invite those that are interested to respond. Jenny?
So if anybody would be interested to join Sue in a group like that, Sue, are you comfortable sharing your email, or would you rather them email me and me pass their names on to you?
I think going straight to you, Jenny, would be wonderful. That way we have a conduit that is, reliable over the years. Yeah.
Okay, so if anybody is interested, or if you know somebody who isn't part of this Zoom today that might be interested, email me and I'll pass those names on to Sue. And
yeah, please do. I think that to really get a picture of what would happen, the idea of actually learning but learning to speak with each other openly and comfortably within a white group discussing a book might later lead us to expand this to diverse groups and feel comfortable with really learning the life experiences, the true life heart experiences of our Black neighbors. So it's not necessarily read a book and drop it. It's a read a book, build, find more skills, self-reflection, finding the truth within ourselves, and then working with others to help reach eventually a group of in a diverse way. If that makes sense.
yeah, thanks, Sue.
Okay.
Well, thank you to all of you. And like I said, I know the Holy Spirit's moving in all of you. And so we'll keep listening and taking action as individuals and as groups and as a corporate church as we feel God's Spirit leads us. I want to close our time with a prayer from a booklet of uncommon prayer that Chris introduced us to over the last week or so. It's written by Kenji Kuramitsu. So I thought this prayer was a great way to end the class. It kind of fits in with, I thought, Transfiguration Sunday too a little bit. But let us close our time together in prayer. Would you pray with me? Incarnated God, you do not bring us to the suburbs of a cloudy, ethereal otherworld, but instead call us to occupy and transform this earthly world to the fullest. We know that you are concerned not merely with the souls of humans, but also with the slums that damn us, the economic conditions that strangle us, the strategic and systemic racism that avails Black people and bodies. Teach us to reject theologies that spiritualize away pain and excuse human suffering in the here and now and focus only on heaven. Let us speak and let our lives in tandem with your words be a witness in the world for you, so that your kingdom might more fully come to this place through the partnership and leadership of Jesus Christ. Amen. Peace be with you all.
Speak with you.